She showed up at the hospital without permission when I gave birth. $341,000. That's the number that started haunting me 11 days after I gave birth to my daughter. Not because of hospital bills, not because of formula or diapers or the 1,000 tiny costs that come with a newborn. $341,000 is what my husband's family trust was supposed to hold in reserve. Inheritance money from his late father, money that was supposed to secure our daughter's future. When I finally pulled the statements, there was less than $9,000 left. But that's not even where this story starts. This story starts in a hospital room, 4 hours after the hardest, most exhausting, most beautiful moment of my life, when a woman who had no legal right to be there walked past a nurse's station, past a check-in desk, past 2 closed doors, and into my recovery room, uninvited, unannounced, and as I'd later learn, not for the reason she claimed. She said she just wanted to see the baby. She was actually there to see if I was too weak, too drugged, too distracted to notice what she'd already done to our finances, and to make sure I stayed that way a little longer. She thought she got away with it? She was wrong. My husband handled the hospital that day, but what came after, the paper trail, the forensic accountant, the FBI field office, the courtroom, that part I handled myself. And by the time I was done, she didn't just lose access to our family, she lost her house, her freedom, and every dollar she thought she'd hidden. This is the story of a woman who called herself just trying to help, stole $350,000 from her own son, and how a maternity ward became the first crime scene in an investigation that ended with her in handcuffs. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to true stories of financial betrayal. The scammers, the fraudsters, the family members who exploit trust for money, and most importantly, how the victims fought back and got their justice. Today's story is about greed, betrayal, and getting every single dollar back. It involves a trust fund, a forged power of attorney, a shell company registered in another state, and a woman who thought that being someone's mother gave her a blank check to someone's life savings.
Linda knew all of this. She sat through the estate attorney's briefing. She signed the acknowledgement of fiduciary duty. She understood, on paper, exactly what she was and was not allowed to do with that money. Mark and I met 2 years after his father's death, when the trust was already established and Linda was already 3 years into managing it. From my perspective, entering the relationship, everything about the arrangement looked completely normal. Mark would occasionally mention the trust, the way you'd mention a 401k you don't check very often, an abstraction, a number that existed somewhere being handled by someone responsible. Linda made herself indispensable in small, constant ways. She helped us find our first apartment, calling in a favor with a property manager she knew. She helped plan our wedding, personally negotiating a discount with the caterer. When Mark's car transmission died, Linda lent us $4,000 for a replacement, though notably that loan came directly out of pocket, not from the trust, which in hindsight I now understand was a calculated move. She wanted us dependent on her generosity in visible, traceable ways, while the real money moved somewhere we couldn't see. She talked constantly about our future, about grandchildren, about setting the family upright. She positioned herself not as a gatekeeper, but as our biggest advocate, the one person fighting on our behalf to make sure the trust grew before it was released to us. "I want you two to have more than just $300,000, she told me once over wine about 8 months before I got pregnant. "I've got it working for you. Trust me." I did trust her. That was the whole design. Looking back now with everything I know, I can point to at least 6 distinct moments where the truth was sitting right in front of us. Red flag 1. Linda never once showed us a full account statement. Whenever Mark asked how the trust was doing, she'd give a verbal number. "It's up over $360 now, don't worry about it." But she always had a reason the paperwork wasn't handy. She was between financial advisors, the statements were mailed to her old address, she'd get it together soon. Red flag 2, around 18 months before my due date, Linda quietly changed financial advisors twice without ever introducing us to either one or providing contact information. A responsible trustee wants beneficiaries to have a relationship with the professionals managing their inheritance. Linda actively kept that relationship from existing. Red flag 3, Linda began pushing hard for Mark to sign a general power of attorney, just in case something happens to me, so you're not stuck in probate hell like we were with your dad. Mark, trusting and non-confrontational by nature, agreed without reading the fine print closely. That document, we'd later discover, gave Linda far broader authority over jointly titled accounts than either of us understood at the time.
Red flag 4. Jenna, Mark's sister, mentioned once at Thanksgiving, almost as a throwaway comment, that her share of the trust had been released early the year before, and that Linda had asked her to keep it quiet from Mark so he doesn't feel behind. At the time, I brushed this off as sibling dynamics. In hindsight, it was Linda isolating the two heirs from comparing notes. Red flag 5, Linda formed an LLC. She told us it was for consulting work she was doing in retirement, nothing to do with us. We had no reason to think otherwise. That LLC's name was Meridian Family Holdings, and I would come to know that name better than I ever wanted to. Red flag 6, and the one that should have been unmissable, Linda began insisting that all financial conversations happen one-on-one, never with Mark and me together. "Let's not turn this into a whole production," she'd say. "Just me and Mark, quick chat." Isolating a target from a support system is one of the oldest tricks in financial manipulation. Whether it's a romance scam or a family member exploiting a trust, Linda used it instinctively. None of these things in isolation screamed fraud. That's exactly how financial abuse inside families works. It's not one dramatic red flag, it's a slow accumulation of small, explainable inconsistencies, each one easy to forgive on its own. 2 months before I got pregnant, Mark and I finally hit what Robert's trust document called full financial stability. We bought our first home, a modest 3-bedroom in a good school district, both of us employed full-time. Under the terms of the trust, this triggered the release clause. Linda was legally obligated to transfer the full trust balance to Mark. She stalled for 6 weeks, citing paperwork with the new advisor. When she finally sent a check, it wasn't for $341,000 or even the roughly $380,000 it should have grown to with reasonable investment returns over 4 years. It was for $62,000. Linda's explanation was smooth, immediate, and almost plausible. The market had been rough, she'd made some conservative moves to protect the principal after a downturn, there were advisor fees and an early tax situation that ate into the balance. She apologized for it being less than we hoped, framed it as bad luck rather than mismanagement, and, this is the part that still makes my stomach turn, she handed Mark the check at a family dinner in front of Jenna and Linda's boyfriend, so that questioning it too hard would feel like making a scene. Mark, grieving his father, trusting his mother, and honestly just excited to have money toward our new house, didn't push. I wish I had pushed. I didn't know enough to know what to push on. That $62,000 check is what set the trap. It gave us just enough money to believe the story. It gave Linda just enough cover to believe she'd gotten away with the rest. She had no idea that 7 months later, in a hospital recovery room, her own decision to show up uninvited would be the first thread that unraveled everything. I went into labor on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 days past my due date after 31 hours that I will spare you the details of. Our daughter, Emma, was born at 6:47 p.m., 7 pounds, 2 ounces, healthy, screaming, perfect. Mark had messaged our immediate family the second she arrived, his sister Jenna, my parents, and Linda. Hospital policy was clear and posted at every entrance. No visitors outside the approved list without the patient's explicit consent, and no visitors at all during the first several hours of recovery, given complications from a longer labor that had me on IV fluids and monitoring. Linda was not on the approved list. We deliberately kept the list small, just Jenna and my parents, because I wanted quiet and because, if I'm honest, some instinct in me wanted space from Linda during something this vulnerable. I didn't know why I felt that way yet. I just did. At around 11 p.m., 4 hours after Emma was born, while I was still recovering, still on medication, still barely able to sit up, a nurse's aide knocked and said there was a family member outside asking to come in, a woman who'd told the front desk she was the baby's grandmother and had every right to be there. Mark stepped into the hallway. Linda was standing at the nurse's station, and according to the charge nurse, who later gave a statement, she was not simply asking politely, she was insisting, raising her voice slightly, telling staff that hospital policy doesn't apply to grandmothers, that she'd driven 40 minutes, that she just needed 5 minutes with my grandbaby. Mark asked her, calmly at first, to respect our wishes and come back the next day when I'd be stronger and visiting hours would allow it properly. Linda's response is what changed everything. She told Mark, in a hallway in front of hospital staff, that she needed to talk to him about something important, alone, right now, and that it couldn't wait until tomorrow. Mark, exhausted, protective, and frankly stunned by his mother showing up uninvited on what should have been one of the most private nights of our lives, told her no. He told her that whatever it was could absolutely wait, that this was not the time or place, and that if she didn't leave, he'd ask hospital security to escort her out. She left, but not before saying something Mark didn't fully register the weight of until weeks later. "You need to sign something before your birthday, Mark. I'm serious. It has to happen before your birthday."
Mark's birthday was 6 weeks away. At the time, exhausted and overwhelmed with a newborn, Mark chalked it up to Linda being Linda. Dramatic, pushy, always needing something urgent. He came back into my room, apologized for the interruption, and told me his mom had shown up and he'd sent her home. I remember being irritated but not alarmed. New parents have 100 small indignities to deal with. This felt like one more. It wasn't until 11 days later, when I was home, sleep-deprived, breastfeeding at 3 a.m. with my laptop open because I couldn't sleep anyway, that I decided, almost as a distraction, almost idly, to finally log into the trust account portal Linda had set up for us months earlier and never fully walked us through. I want to walk you through this moment carefully because I remember every second of it. I logged in using the credentials Linda had emailed Mark when the $62,000 check was released. I expected to see a closed account, a zero balance, a note confirming full transfer. Instead, I found something that didn't make sense. The trust account wasn't closed at all. It was still active. It still had transaction history, and the balance sitting in it was $8,412.19. Not zero, not closed, just almost empty. I sat there in the dark, nursing my newborn with one arm, scrolling through 18 months of transaction history with the other hand, and I watched $300 and some thousand disappear in front of me, transaction by transaction, right there on the screen. There were wire transfers, 4 of them, ranging from $18,000 to $61,000, each one going to an account labeled Meridian Family Holdings LLC, the same LLC Linda had told us was for her unrelated consulting work. There were advisor fee withdrawals, 17 of them over 4 years, each one a round number, like $2,500 or $3,000, paid to something called Whitfield Strategic Partners, a name I'd never heard Linda mention once in 4 years of vague updates. There was a $40,000 transfer dated just 6 weeks before Emma was born to a mortgage servicing company, a company I didn't recognize, servicing a property I'd never heard of. And there, dated exactly 2 days before Mark's upcoming birthday, the deadline Linda had been so desperate about in that hospital hallway, was a pending transaction awaiting a second signature, a request to fully liquidate the remaining $8,412.19 and close the account permanently. She needed Mark's signature to finish closing it out clean, with no remaining active account for us to stumble into. That's what she'd shown up at the hospital to get. I sat in that dark nursery and did the math out loud, whispering it to my sleeping daughter because I needed to say it to someone. $341,000 in the original trust. 4 years of documented growth potential in a conservative index fund alone would have pushed that closer to $390,000. We'd received $62,000. That left, by my count, somewhere between $320,000 and $328,000 unaccounted for, and the account currently held less than $9,000. Linda hadn't made conservative moves to protect the principal. Linda had been stealing from her son's inheritance for 4 years, and she'd tried to walk into my hospital room hours after I gave birth to get the final signature she needed to erase the evidence before we ever thought to look. We didn't confront Linda that week. I want to be honest about why. We were terrified of being wrong, terrified of blowing up a family relationship over what might have an explanation, and utterly exhausted with a 2-week-old baby. So Mark called her, carefully, and asked, not accused, just asked, for a full accounting of the trust. Every statement, every transaction. Full transparency, he said, for our own records now that Emma's here and we're thinking about her future. Linda's response told us everything we needed to know before we'd even opened a single subpoena. She got defensive immediately. She said the request felt hurtful and distrustful after everything she sacrificed for the family. She said the records were with her accountant and would take time to gather. She brought up, unprompted, how hard it had been managing everything alone since Robert died, as though financial transparency was an insult to her grief. And then, 3 days later, she called Mark and, without being asked again, offered him an additional $20,000 as a show of good faith to put toward the baby, on the condition that he not make this into something ugly with lawyers. That $20,000 offer, unprompted, tied explicitly to avoiding lawyers, is what's sometimes called consciousness of guilt evidence, behavior that only makes sense if the person already knows they've done something wrong and is trying to buy silence before the situation escalates. Prosecutors love this kind of evidence. It tends to matter a great deal to juries. Mark didn't take the money. He told her he needed to think about it. And that night, we made the decision that would define the next 5 months of our lives. We were going to find out exactly where every dollar went, and we were going to get it all back. Before we go further, I have to tell you about the first real smoking gun, because it's what turned a hurt family into a criminal investigation.
2 weeks into quietly gathering documents, I found the original power of attorney form Mark had signed, the one Linda pushed for, framed as protection in case something happens to me. I compared the notarization date against Mark's own calendar, cross-referenced through his email and phone records. The notary's stamp was dated for a day Mark was, provably, 600 miles away at a work conference. Flight records, hotel confirmation, a LinkedIn photo from the conference floor time-stamped that same afternoon. Mark never signed that document in front of a notary at all. Someone had forged his signature and used a notary stamp that, we'd later learn, through the state's notary commission database, belonged to a woman who, small world, happened to be a close personal friend of Linda's from her book club. Forged notarization on a power of attorney document isn't a family dispute anymore. That's felony forgery, and depending on the state, it can carry real prison time on its own, entirely separate from the theft itself. We stopped thinking of this as a hurt feelings situation that week. We started building a case. Here's something nobody tells you about discovering you've been defrauded by family. The emotional part and the procedural part happen at the exact same time, and you don't get to pick which one you deal with first. I was still bleeding through nursing pads and pumping milk bags in the bathroom of an elder law attorney's office, while also learning what the term surcharge action meant. I became a detective in the spaces between feedings. The first thing our attorney told us, a fantastic elder and trust fraud litigator named Patricia Ruiz, who we found after 3 consultations that went nowhere, was that the single most powerful thing we could do was build an airtight, dated financial timeline before Linda knew we were building a legal case, not just asking uncomfortable family questions. So that's what I did. Every night after Emma's 2 a.m. feeding, instead of going back to sleep, I opened a spreadsheet. I requested, through Mark since he was the beneficiary with legal standing, the full transaction history directly from the trust's custodial bank, going around Linda entirely. Banks are required to provide account records to beneficiaries of a trust on request, even when a trustee would prefer otherwise, and ours complied within 12 business days. What came back was 190 pages of statements covering 4 years. I built a line-by-line ledger. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every wire. I color-coded it. Green for legitimate trust management, yellow for unclear items needing verification, red for clearly self-dealing.
By the time I finished, the red column alone totaled $298,600. Patricia connected us with a forensic accountant named Devon Okafor, who specializes in tracing exactly this kind of family trust diversion. Devon pulled the public business registration for Meridian Family Holdings, LLC, and found something Linda had almost certainly assumed we'd never bother checking. The LLC's registered agent address was Linda's own home. The listed manager was Linda herself, and the LLC had been formed just 11 days after Robert's estate cleared probate, before Linda had transferred a single dollar of the trust anywhere. She built the funnel before she needed it. Devon traced the 4 large wire transfers, the ones totaling $172,000, from the trust account into Meridian Family Holdings, and then followed them further. From Meridian, the money split 3 ways. A chunk went toward a mortgage on a lake house Linda had purchased 18 months earlier under the LLC's name, a property she'd told everyone in the family was an investment rental she was managing on the side. Another chunk went to a joint account Linda shared with a man named Gary, her boyfriend, whom we knew about, but who we didn't know she'd been quietly commingling trust funds with. And a final chunk, nearly $40,000, went to a series of what Devon's report described as structured cash withdrawals, repeated withdrawals just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers a bank's currency transaction report, spaced days apart, a pattern federal investigators recognize instantly as an attempt to avoid detection. Structuring cash withdrawals to avoid reporting thresholds isn't just suspicious. Under federal law, it's its own separate crime, regardless of whether the underlying money was stolen. The advisor fees paid to Whitfield Strategic Partners turned out to be almost entirely fictional. Devon found that Whitfield Strategic Partners wasn't even a registered investment advisory firm. It was, per state business filings, a sole proprietorship registered to, you guessed it, Gary, Linda's boyfriend, who had no securities license, no advisory registration, and, as far as we could tell, no actual financial expertise beyond a community college accounting class he'd taken in the 1990s. Linda had been paying her own boyfriend advisor fees out of her son's inheritance for services that, as far as we could document, were never actually performed. Patricia advised us that a case this size, north of $250,000, involving forged notarization, wire fraud, and a shell company belonged in front of both the local district attorney's financial crimes unit and, given the interstate wire transfers, potentially the FBI. We filed a formal report with our county's financial crimes division first. Detective Ramos, who caught the case, told us something that stuck with me. Family financial exploitation cases are chronically underreported and underprosecuted precisely because victims feel guilty, feel like they're destroying the family by pursuing charges, and often drop the case halfway through out of guilt. He said the cases that actually make it to conviction are almost always the ones where the victim brought organized documentation, not just a story.
We had organized documentation, 4 years of it, color-coded. Detective Ramos's unit issued subpoenas to the trust's custodial bank, to Meridian Family Holdings Business Bank, and the notary's records, because 2 of the wire transfers had crossed state lines to a bank headquartered outside our state, and because forged notarization combined with interstate wire transfer can implicate federal wire fraud statutes. The case eventually drew the interest of the FBI's local field office, who opened a parallel financial crimes file. I remember sitting across from an FBI financial crimes agent, Emma asleep in her car seat carrier next to me, answering questions about withdrawal patterns while trying not to wake my daughter. There were 2 moments where Linda nearly slipped away from what was coming. The first happened about 6 weeks into the investigation, before Detective Ramos had fully built his case. Linda, sensing something was wrong from the tone of Mark's communications, attempted to quietly transfer the deed on the lake house into Gary's name alone. An attempt, Devin later confirmed, to move the asset out of anything traceable to trust funds in case things escalated. Fortunately, Patricia had already filed a civil action requesting a temporary restraining order and a lis pendens, a legal notice recorded against the property, freezing the asset before the transfer could complete. The deed transfer attempt itself, oddly enough, became more evidence of consciousness of guilt for prosecutors. The second near miss was worse. Linda found out through Jenna that we'd hired a forensic accountant, and she attempted to preemptively settle things by showing up at our house unannounced, again uninvited, a pattern with her by this point, offering to just pay everything back quietly, no lawyers, no police, for the family's sake. She had, by her own account that day, roughly $40,000 in liquid savings she offered on the spot, a fraction of what was owed. If we'd taken that offer, in that moment, without documentation, without a formal restitution agreement drafted by an attorney, we would have gotten $40,000 and lost any leverage, civil or criminal, to recover the other $250,000. Patricia had warned us this exact scenario would happen. The quiet settlement attempt is almost universal in family fraud cases because it lets the perpetrator control the narrative and avoid a permanent record. We declined. Politely, but firmly. Mark told his mother, standing on our own front porch with our daughter asleep inside, that this was no longer a conversation the two of them could have privately. It was in the hands of attorneys and investigators now, and it would stay there. 9 weeks into the investigation, Devin's forensic accounting turned up the piece of evidence that made the criminal case airtight. Buried in the trust's account activity was a document Linda had uploaded to the online portal herself back when she still controlled full access, an internal memo apparently drafted,
her own record-keeping and never intended for us to see, that had been auto-saved in the portal's document history feature, a feature she either didn't know existed or forgot to check. It was titled simply Trust Plan. It laid out in her own handwriting, scanned into a PDF, a rough month-by-month schedule of withdrawal amounts, matched almost exactly against the actual transaction history Devin had already traced, alongside a handwritten note that read, "Keep under advisor threshold. M won't check until stable. Tell J to say nothing." M was Mark. J was Jenna. That single page did more work than 4 years of bank statements combined because it proved intent. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't bad investment decisions. It was a plan. 10 months after that hospital hallway confrontation, Detective Ramos called Mark with an update. The district attorney's office was formally filing charges against Linda for felony embezzlement from a trust, felony forgery for the fraudulent power of attorney notarization, and structuring cash transactions to evade federal reporting requirements. Given the total loss amount exceeding $300,000, the embezzlement charge alone carried a potential sentencing range under our state statute of up to 20 years, though our attorneys were careful to explain that actual sentencing for first-time offenders in cases like this typically lands far below the statutory maximum. Simultaneously, Patricia filed a civil action on Mark's behalf for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking full restitution of the missing funds plus statutory interest and attorney's fees, a separate track from the criminal case running in parallel, because criminal conviction and civil recovery are two entirely different processes with two different burdens of proof. Linda's criminal defense attorney initially pushed for a plea to a single lesser charge with no prison time, banking on the "it's a family matter, she's a grandmother, there's no real victim who wants prison" narrative that defense attorneys lean on heavily in cases like this. Mark and I made the decision, together, that we would not push for the maximum possible prison sentence out of vengeance, but we would not accept a plea that let Linda avoid a felony conviction and full restitution either. We wanted accountability on the record, and we wanted every dollar back. Prison time, if it happened, needed to be the court's decision based on facts, not our personal crusade. The evidence made that decision easy for the DA's office. Faced with the forged notarization, the Shull Company timeline predating the trust distribution, the structured withdrawals, and, most damning of all, Linda's own handwritten trust plan memo, her attorney's negotiating position collapsed. 14 months after charges were filed, Linda pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement from a trust and felony forgery in exchange for the prosecution not pursuing the separate structuring charge and recommending a reduced but still substantial prison term. At sentencing, the judge handed down 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and ordered full restitution of $318,500. The final court-verified total.
The theft, once Devon's forensic accounting was formally entered into evidence, plus statutory interest, to be paid first through immediate seizure of recoverable assets, with the remainder structured as a court-ordered payment plan enforceable through wage garnishments and asset liens for the rest of her working life if necessary. Because Patricia had gotten that lis pendens filed early, back during the first near miss, when Linda tried to quietly move the lake house deed, the property was still legally encumbered when the criminal conviction came down. As part of the restitution order, the court authorized a forced sale of the lake house. It sold for $287,000. After the outstanding mortgage on the property was paid off, roughly $94,000 in net proceeds went directly toward restitution. The remaining balance in the joint account Linda shared with Gary, the one that had received a portion of the diverted trust funds, was frozen, and following a separate civil finding that Gary had knowingly received stolen trust assets, even if he hadn't orchestrated the theft himself, a negotiated settlement returned an additional $61,000. Gary, notably, was also referred separately for potential charges related to the fictitious Whitfield Strategic Partners advisory fees, since accepting payment for financial advisory services without proper licensing is itself a regulatory violation, on top of knowingly receiving stolen funds. He avoided criminal charges through a civil settlement and a cooperation agreement, but lost his own home in the process to cover his portion of the settlement. Between the forced property sale, the frozen account settlement, wage garnishment against Linda's pension beginning immediately upon her release, and a lump sum payment Linda's own siblings, mortified by what she'd done, quietly contributed to reduce her exposure, Mark and I recovered $301,000 of the $318,500 owed within the first 14 months after sentencing. The remaining balance continues to be paid through mandated wage garnishment, with full recovery projected within the following 3 years. Beyond the courtroom, Linda's exposure within the family and community was its own form of consequence. Jenna, who'd been quietly complicit in staying silent about her own early trust release, ultimately cooperated fully with investigators once she understood the scale of what her mother had done to Mark, testifying under subpoena about the conversation where Linda had asked her to say nothing. That testimony, corroborating the note found in the trust plan document, was pivotal. Linda's local social circle, largely built around her church community and her book club, including, notably, the notary friend who was separately investigated for potential complicity in the forged power of attorney document, learned the details through the public court record, as embezzlement and forgery convictions are a matter of public record in nearly every jurisdiction. Local news picked up a brief item on the sentencing, given the unusual size of the family trust theft for our area. Here's the part of this story that still, honestly, stuns me every time I think about it.
Throughout the investigation, we kept assuming the core motive was Gary, that Linda had fallen for a man who talked her into funneling money toward a shared life, a lake house, the joint future. That was partially true. But during the sentencing phase, when the court ordered a full accounting of where every diverted dollar had gone, we learned something none of us had guessed. Roughly $85,000 of the stolen trust funds hadn't gone to the lake house or to Gary or to any lifestyle upgrade at all. It had gone to a second grandchild. 14 years before any of this,
Linda's oldest son, Mark's older half-brother from a relationship before she married Robert, a man Mark had met exactly twice in his life and had no relationship with, had a daughter. That half-brother struggled financially for most of his adult life, in and out of stable housing, and Linda, who'd apparently maintained a secret, ongoing relationship with that side of the family that she'd deliberately hidden from Robert, from Mark, and from Jenna for over a decade, had been quietly funneling money to support her granddaughter's private school tuition, medical bills, and eventually a down payment on her son's first stable apartment in years. It wasn't a simple story of greed for a lake house. It was that too, but underneath it was a decades-long secret Linda had been protecting by any means necessary, including stealing from the son she raised openly to fund the family she'd hidden. Mark's reaction to this discovery was more complicated than his reaction to the theft itself. There was anger, still, but there was also, for the first time in the entire process, something closer to grief for his mother, rather than just rage at her. The recognition that an entire hidden life had been running parallel to his own for his whole adulthood, and that the woman who showed up uninvited at the hospital that night hadn't just been trying to protect a theft. She'd been trying to protect a secret she'd spent 14 years hiding, terrified that once the money ran out and questions started, the whole hidden family would be exposed along with it. It didn't excuse anything. If anything, it explained the desperation behind that hospital hallway, why she'd needed Mark's signature before her birthday, why she'd been willing to interrupt a delivery recovery room to get it. She wasn't just closing an account. She was racing against a deadline she'd created herself, terrified of what would unravel if she didn't get ahead of it. Mark and I put the restitution money toward paying off our mortgage entirely and establishing a separate, professionally managed trust for Emma, this time with a licensed, independently vetted corporate trustee, full transparency requirements, and quarterly statements sent directly to both of us, with no single family member ever holding unilateral control again. We also, on Patricia's advice, updated every piece of estate and power of attorney documentation in both our names, using an attorney-verified notary process with photo ID verification and video-recorded signing sessions, specifically to prevent the exact kind of forged authorization that started this whole nightmare.
Mark has not spoken to Linda since her sentencing. He sends updates about Emma to her prison-approved email account on his own schedule, purely so that Emma someday has the option to know her grandmother existed. He has made no promises about what happens after her release. Jenna, Mark, and I are closer now than we've ever been, bonded, oddly, by having gone through this together and by choosing transparency with each other as the new family standard going forward. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's that financial abuse inside families is one of the most underreported forms of fraud in this country, precisely because it hides behind love, obligation, and guilt. The scammer who calls from a fake tech support number is a stranger. It's easy to hang up on a stranger. It is astronomically harder to hang up on your own mother. So, here are the warning signs, drawn directly from our experience, that I want you to actually remember. 1. If someone managing money on your behalf, a trustee, a power of attorney holder, a family helper, consistently avoids giving you full written account statements and instead gives you verbal updates, that is not normal. Legitimate financial management always comes with paper trails, and a legitimate manager wants you to see them. 2. Watch for isolation tactics. If a family member insists on one-on-one financial conversations, discourages you from comparing notes with siblings, or frames basic transparency requests as hurtful or distrustful, that emotional reaction is doing the work that documentation should be doing instead. 3. Be suspicious of any unprompted offer of a good faith partial payment that comes bundled with a request to avoid lawyers or formal processes. Innocent people don't need to buy your silence. That offer is often the clearest evidence you'll get that something is wrong. 4. If you sign any power of attorney, trust, or estate document, insist on an independent notary you've verified yourself, not one suggested to you by the person who benefits from the document, and keep your own copy immediately. 5. Structured cash withdrawals just under reporting thresholds, unfamiliar LLCs registered around the same time as a windfall, and advisor fees paid to advisors you've never met or verified are all classic laundering and diversion patterns. A 5-minute search of your state's business registration database can verify whether an LLC or an advisor is even legitimate. And 6, the one this whole story hinges on. Notice when someone tries to create urgency around getting your signature, a deadline, a birthday, before it's too late. Legitimate financial processes are rarely that time-sensitive. Manufactured urgency is one of the oldest tools in the fraud playbook, whether it's a stranger on the phone or your own mother standing in a hospital hallway. If you take one thing from today's story, let it be this. Protecting your finances from someone you love isn't a betrayal of that relationship. It's the only thing that gives that relationship a chance to survive the truth. Have you ever been financially betrayed by someone you trusted? A family member, a partner, a friend? I want to hear what happened in the comments. And if the story hit home for you, or if you learned even one thing that helps you protect yourself, hit subscribe, because next week I'm telling you about a woman who discovered her fiancé had been running the exact same trust me with the money scheme on 3 different women at the same time, and how one shared spreadsheet brought all 3 of them together to take him down. Thank you for watching. Stay sharp out there, and I'll see you in the next one.